With a partnership, have those difficult conversations with who you're going into partnership with so that you guys can figure out how you do communicate. Because if you can't agree to figure out, like how things are going to be possibly at their worst when you're at your best, they're probably not going to work out as a partnership for you.
Welcome to the Good Stewards Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to seasoned real estate investors who want to maximize the cash flow potential in their business. We are buy and hold investors with 1,000+ properties and markets across the U.S. who bring an insider's view into the nitty-gritty details of real estate investing. If you're looking to develop the mindset, teams, and systems that can dramatically build your real estate business and net worth, you're in the right place.
Welcome to this episode of the Good Stewards Podcast. I'm Ryan Dossie.
I'm Amanda Perkins.
I'm Bill Sirius.
And I'm Andrew Sirius.
Welcome. We're glad you joined us today. We have a really good podcast, I think, for you, and we're going to take a deep dive into all things partnership-ish. So if you've ever been in a partnership, if you've contemplated a partnership, if you've thought, I have had my fill of partnerships, no matter where you're at, we're going to get into it. So I actually got introduced to partnerships very early on when I was a real estate investor. And by the way, I should be remiss to say, if you haven't been with us before, please check us out at thegoodstewards.com. And we have a free ebook for you to grab there as well. But in terms of partnerships, I was introduced to a couple of people who were one was a temporary partner and one has been a partner virtually for life. His name is Greg Whiteley, and we partnered initially on one multifamily project that a real estate agent brought us together on. It's been a great, not just partnership, but a friendship that has grown out of that. The other person was more temporary, just a few deals for a few years. But it introduced me early on to the value of partnerships and also the pitfalls of partnerships. And there's certainly both. I mean, partnership is like getting married. I don't know what the divorce rate is. I don't even want to look it up, but it's fairly high. And the divorce rate in partnerships is also fairly high. Now, it's not always ending because of somebody stole something or there was great mistrust or something. Sometimes they just end because people turn different directions. But you need to be ready from the very beginning when you're contemplating partnerships about how it might end and be ready for that at the very beginning. Some don't, but many, many do. My partnership with my wife has lasted 43 plus years now, and I expect it will continue to last. But partnerships are very much like that getting married thing, because you're joining with another person in a business relationship that has deep implications for how your business will go. So that's just to kick it off with. The question is, where do you start with it? Anybody want to jump in at this point in terms of their...
I'll hop in with the what not to do. So I don't know what it is about new investors, but we see a lot of brand new wholesalers, flippers, buy and hold guys that like partner up real quick. And I would compare this to getting married at 18, right? Like it's typically two people. I like to think of them as two drowning people going down a river that neither of them know how to swim, but they think if they hold together, they'll float, right? And that's typically not how it works. I kind of have just like three quick rules. First one, it has to be mutually beneficial. The partners have to be bringing different things to the partnership. Two, there has to be like a purpose or like a goal behind it, right? And it can't just be like, we're going to stack checks. Like there has to be like, hey, we're going to do our first 5 deals together, or we're going to buy 5 properties together. The other thing I like is to see like a reassessment of, hey, we're going to do this until this time frame or until this goal is made. I think like a marriage piece of, you have to have that level of like honesty and communication. of you've got to be able to be like, hey, I'm not feeling heard when you're talking to another dude, right? Like it's something you've got to kind of check your ego at the door with. But I would just caution anybody new who's listening to this on just like going out and finding a business partner because you don't want to fail alone. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to often is like, it's okay if it's not just me, but if it's all me and it fails, then I'm the one who failed. So the only reason I preface that, we're going to talk about a lot of good things with partnerships and some not so great things, but I didn't want this to be like a partnership pitch for anybody new that's listening.
When I think of partnerships, Ryan, I think of the word synergistic. And synergy means that 1 + 1 equals more than 2. It equals 3.
Not 1 + 1 equals a half.
That's a drowning partnership. Yeah. But a partnership where you're bringing in different people. Think about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. You've got the visionary and you've got the operator. As a matter of fact, Amanda and I were talking about this a couple of days ago, that you need different skill sets essentially to build a business. And having a skill set plus ownership of the business makes for a powerful potential connection with each other. And you need in that case, they needed a visionary and they needed an operator. And the two Steves, initially built a very powerful business that became what we know of Apple today. But many partnerships started that way, where people came together because they saw the potential of them joining was actually more than the sum of their parts. The whole was greater than the sum of their parts. And I would think any partnership you get into, that's an evaluation you need to make. Am I going to, in joining with this person or these people, is what we're creating better than what we could do individually?
No, I totally
and
agree.
I think you should look at what kind of partnership are you creating too. I mean, with regards to, are you adding something more than just time and energy? Like, is there, if you're having a partnership where, let's say, some partnerships are just simply passive. Like if somebody's putting, we talked about this before, the big purchase of 97 properties here in Kansas City. We brought on partners that helped with the equity side of that purchase and that one was a tenants in common, but there are others like syndications for apartment complex where they're simply bringing money to the table. And the syndications are securities. That's another topic, but where there are partnerships where we have an active partner and a passive partner. And there's the passive partner is basically just collecting checks from your work. They're putting in the money or most of the money, you're putting in less. There are partnerships where it's evenly split. Both people are doing everything. There are partnerships where both people are doing very different things, kind of like your very first one, Dad, where you found the properties and your partner did the rehabs. Or there's partnerships where someone puts in most of the money and some of the work, and the other person puts in a little bit of the money. And so it's important to see what exactly you're looking for in that partnership and design the partnership accordingly. Because those partnerships, for example, on that 97 property is solely on that portfolio. You could have a passive partner that's for your entire company, just funding it, or on a property by property basis with groups of passive investors and things along those lines.
Yeah, what's always tricky is to know the end. When you start at the beginning, there's oftentimes a lot of enthusiasm and momentum.
The honeymoon phase, we'll call it.
That honeymoon phase, yeah. But then things change. Not necessarily the partner becomes dishonest, but their situation in life might change. All of a sudden they get married and they have other priorities, or they get to a certain point financially and they want to do other things. So life changes, and that's a constant, that things will change. So
I think that's one of the parallels we make with a marriage of, if it's a mutually beneficial relationship and you can change and grow together, that's ideal. What doesn't work when it's like, well, I want you to be who you were before. I mean, my wife and I joke about this all the time in our marriage, but when we got married, she wanted to be a journalist and I wanted to be a cop. She's now a military psychologist and I'm a real estate investor with a couple other companies. We've changed a lot as people, but I think it's important if you're in a partnership that, hey, this needs to be a long-term thing, that you're able to grow together and kind of have space for that.
Well, and, brings up, ironing out kind of the details as you go along up front, because sometimes those are really difficult conversations to navigate yourself through. I would say kind of like a prenup, except for not the same, because most people go into marriage hoping it's forever, but, prenup can be smart. But with a partnership, have those difficult conversations with who you're going into partnership with so that you guys can figure out how you do communicate. Because if you can't agree to figure out, like how things are going to be possibly at their worst when you're at your best, they're probably not going to work out as a partnership for you.
Add money and emotions and
Absolutely.
see how it goes.
It's the what ifs that you need to fine tune. And bringing a lawyer into this is not a bad idea at all. Somebody who has more experience, has been around around the landscape and seen a lot of disasters happen and seen a lot of successes happen as well. Talking to other partners, really getting a feel for what this could be and could not be going into it. Because not only do people change, but circumstances change. And sometimes, interesting, Greg and I, for instance, have been through some pretty stressful experiences together. And I'm here to say that he does well under stress. And not all partners do well under stress, but very likely your partnership will come under stress at some point. And you don't even know how they're going to react under stress. Financial distress is what I'm talking about in particular. So, you just can't anticipate how things are going to go, and you need to anticipate how they might go up front and protect yourself as much as possible in the initial stages of setting out the expectations of the partnership.
And really, it's a relationship. So if somebody tells you something about themselves, I can think of for instance, we have somebody who he told us many times, I am not a good partner. I'm not a good partner. And he's not a good partner so he is a good partner in some ways, but he's not a good partner just because, there isn't a lot of compromise that happens in his head initially. But, we moved forward and it worked out, it works out, but you have to realize, sometimes when people tell you stuff, you need to listen to what they're saying. So, some people aren't good partners. And if they tell you, we're not good partners, but we think, oh, we're going to try this anyway. Listen to those nagging red flags along the way. This is a time for you guys to really figure things out before you dive in and are in the middle of trying to figure out your business transaction. And then you're realizing, relationally, things are different. Things are difficult.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is just setting proper expectations. Bill's got the quote of, expectations that aren't discussed are what premeditated resentments. And, making sure that, I expect you to do X, and that is communicated in writing. I think a lot of new people make the mistake of well, yeah, we downloaded an operating agreement off of LegalZoom and we're good to go. It's okay, but who does what in what situation, in what scenario? We're going to talk about a partnership or two that are wrapping up. And the big thing was there were expectations that were communicated clearly in writing that just were not getting done. And, it's having those out in the open before you stack on money and assets. And I mean, the last thing you want, it's kind of it's unfortunate to use this, but we're talking about ending a partnership. It's kind of like a divorce, right? There's divorces where it's hey, we just weren't a good fit anymore. You go your way, I'll go mine. And there's divorces that it's I'm going to make your life a living hell. So it's, having it in writing can make it the former and not the latter, should it go that way.
You've touched on this before, but Ryan, the keys, I think, to partnerships, one is honesty and integrity up front, because you are entering into a relationship that it's just not you anymore. There are other people with their own future, their own goals, their own ambitions in mind, and you've got to be upfront every step of the way and straightforward with each other that is just key to the glue of holding a partnership together, I think, over a long period of time.
Well, I'll say as a stewardship partner, I made the mistake early on of like, I wasn't communicating things that I needed or things that I was necessarily doing or costs that I was carrying that I shouldn't have been carrying. And I think that is one thing that I look at as somebody who is a partner of a huge testament to working with you guys in general is just that, like, I think you've got to make sure the other person always feels like you have their best interests at heart, not just your own. If you're selfish, a partnership is probably not for you.
Unless you find a real doormat, I mean, then maybe you can moosh off them good and whatnot.
All right, just bleed them dry and then discard them when you're done.
Doormat LLC. After the key thing of honesty and integrity, I think working hard, just being committed to hold up your end and work your tail off is really important. If one person is slacking and the other person knows that, that's just a killer. It's just such a motivation sapper. If you think, I'm really putting in all the work here. I had to end one partnership because I felt like that was true. Ultimately, this person was finding a lot of excuses for free time and kind of treading water, and it just wasn't a good experience. Fortunately, it was fairly amicable ending to it, but he just didn't keep up his end of the bargain. And I think once somebody starts flagging in their zeal, that needs to become a topic of conversation, and ongoing communication and straightforwardness is, again, the key to a long-term healthy partnership.
Well, and you have to be able to communicate with your partner, because if you're talking to everybody else and not your partner about the problem you're having, your partner isn't hearing any of that. And so, it's kind of the same thing back to the marriage thing. If you're talking to everybody but your husband about your problems, that's not the best way to handle things. So, you have to, going into things, it's best just to be honest, lay things out, continue to be honest, continue to talk about things. There's going to always be two sides to everything. You need to consider that.
I'll give Noah as an example in Indy. I think it's also important to have somebody who's uniquely skilled in an area that you're not. You can't have two, like alphas that want to do the same thing, trying to partner together, which is what I see a lot of times in new real estate investors. Noah in Indy, I remember early on, we had some really hard conversations, and we went out for lunch, and I was just like, what do you want? Like, what do you want out of life? What is your end goal? Like, what are you aspiring for? And Noah's answer to me was, I've always wanted to be the number 2 behind a powerful number 1. And that was a great answer, right? I think it's difficult if you've got a partner that, like, especially if it's somebody who's like working under you. Because in partnerships, right, there's some authority levels, which I think is something we can talk about. But you've got to have somebody that is like willing to play ball and stay in their lane on what they're uniquely skilled at.
And I think that goes back to the synergistic aspects of a good partnership. By the way, I love Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He does talk about synergy. He also has a chapter in there about win-win relationships. And a partnership needs to continue to be a win-win relationships. And if things are not working out, or if it doesn't look like everybody's going to be on the same page, there's also another category that there's win-lose. Of course, you want to avoid that, or lose-win. But he has a category called win-win or no deal. And I like that because sometimes you just can't negotiate to the point where it makes sense to continue, or it makes sense to enter into this partnership. If you get down to it, it may just be because we both can't win here, or we both can't find a way to win here in terms of a partnership or an ongoing partnership, then we're just going to have to call it quits. We're just going to say it's no deal, and we're going to end as friends rather than enemies here. And I think, again, if you have that mindset going in, that it's either got to be win-win or it's not going to happen, it's not going to continue, that's something that's pretty important in a partnership. In terms of evaluating a person in a partnership in an ongoing sort of way, obviously, what you bring to the table is really important. And you want to not just look at what does the other person bring to the table, but what am I bringing to the table? And that's really a question you should be asking yourself periodically in a partnership. Hopefully, you guys are bringing the kind of different personalities, the different orientations. Somebody's good at this and somebody's good at that kind of thing. There are tests you can take, and one of them is a test called Strength Finders. It's the Clifton Strength Finder test. And one of the very interesting things about the ideas that they present is that people don't really change very much, and your strengths are essentially submitted in by the time you're a young adult. And to try to focus on your weaknesses is really a fool's errand, because you just can't be all things to all people. You can't do it all. And, those who are really good at accounting are often not good at envisioning the future. And those who are good at operations are not necessarily good at a lot of other aspects of the job. So our giftedness is really not that wide, but it should be deep. And the question is, what are you really gifted at? And taking going to the Clifton Strength Finders, which is probably the most popular test out there to kind of figure out where you line up. I think they have 34 different strengths. Where you line up in those strengths can be really helpful in melding together a good partnership.
It'll also give you some compassion for your significant other if you're married, when you realize I don't have much empathy.
It's last.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we're highlighting here is the kind of character of the kind of people that you're wanting to work with. Like the kind of person who goes out and takes a personality test to understand where their strengths and weaknesses are is a human being that's pretty mature or is becoming more mature, versus I'm awesome. That's probably not your guy. So you've got to have somebody that's willing to do some introspection, look at themselves, look at what they bring, and and have them be honest about that. I know to a partnership, I do not bring detail orientation. I'm not a detail oriented person. What I do bring is more the marketing and the creative piece and some of the vision and direction, but I'm not your guy that says these are the 12 steps needed. I just know where I want to end up, which is why in Indy, I've got somebody like Noah, whose job is to then map out the roadmap for, okay, here's how we get there.
And in kind of defining roles, an operating agreement is really important. We've touched on this about putting things in writing, but the more you can kind of define roles and put that in writing, even in a legal document, and again, that might need to change as you go along, but starting with a legal document is pretty important. Now, interestingly enough, Greg and I did not start with a legal document. As a matter of fact, Amanda, I'm not even sure we still have one.
You were tenants in common in your first partnership. So it was, okay. But we do have other tenant in common agreements that have specific outlines. But you also started that partnership, I think in 1994.
Yeah, we started kind of on a napkin basis, and I wouldn't recommend that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think I'm in about 10 different partnerships now, and they all have written operating agreements, maybe with the exception of Greg. But
I think it's 14, but who's counting?
14, okay.
Bill likes partnerships.
Well, interestingly enough, I didn't start that way, and maybe this is something to kind of end up talking about a little. It was a book that kind of changed my perspective. It was a book by Jim Collins called Built to Last. And essentially in that book, he takes 19 companies that have stood the test of time. They're over 50 years old, and they have, even through good and bad times economically, they have become powerhouse companies. And I was kind of more of a solopreneur type of person. But when I kind of read that book and I was evaluating my business at the same time, I realized I was the only investor. I had people doing good work in property management and rehab and maintenance and things like that, but I was the only investor. And if I was to grow my business more than a mom and pop kind of shop, I was going to have to rally around me or, train some people. And it actually started with young people from college. Andrew happened to be going to the University of Oregon at the time and in business school, and he helped me put together an internships over 2 summers, we had 16 business students go through this internship. It was really a long-term kind of a job interview is what it was, because 5 of those people became partners, very young partners in their 20s with me back about 12 dozen years ago or so, maybe a little longer.
Are any of them still around?
Me.
Andrew
well,
is.
Andrew is still along.
Well, I mean,
They're still around in the real
They're-
estate investment world.
They're
They are
dead,
not
if
Bill's
that's what you're
partners.
asking.
They're not Bill's partners.
But one thing that I made the decision, I wanted to grow my business, and that led to that internship, which led to the partnerships. And the subsequent decision then was that I wanted to go back to the Midwest. And having grown up, all these young guys, having grown up in the Northwest, they did take a trip out to the Midwest, looked at a number of different markets, but all of them except Andrew said, no, we'd rather live in the Northwest. So that actually kind of ended those partnerships. Some of those guys continue in
All
partnerships.
of those
actually,
partnerships were mostly flipping operations. And so
That's true.
They weren't long-term buy hold operations that we had to unwind. So it was just sell the properties and move on.
why don't we talk
Right.
about how you unwind a buy and hold partnership? Because we've got 2 of these right now.
Yeah.
Little, definitely messier. I think Amanda, why don't you kind of take this a little bit? Because these weren't your partnerships, but you had to kind of dive in and start to pull them apart.
I mean, really, a buy hold is going, basically it's, we tried to outline expectations, basically we've been over the gist of our business, buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat,
Manage.
If and our partnerships are out of state. So in our situation, we're bringing the lenders and the infrastructure and providing a lot of support, but ultimately it's our partner's responsibility to manage the rehab, oversee the rental business,
Execute the day to
do
day.
that day to day. And with guidance, we're not trying to, throw somebody out, but at the end of the day, yeah, when you have less than 10 properties or even 20, you're going to go out and you're going to be signing agreements and you're going to be showing your properties and you're going to have to collect the rents and you're going to have to set yourself up for the future, because it just doesn't pencil to pay somebody to do that while you're trying to grow. So, there's a way to make it work. And sometimes you have to figure out a way to earn some short-term money, maybe flipping or wholesaling to supplement that. But ultimately it's like, well, this is what we're bringing. And if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, the partnership has to go away, because we can't hold up your end of the bargain from away. And so that's in these particular cases, move people in and you stop managing the property and you stop collecting the rents, and then you're not very communicative. And so ultimately it's sell the properties. And so, it's not as easy as that. Sometimes you have to evict people and then you can sell the properties. And, you didn't go into these properties that you were going to flip them and do, like looking for a retail buyer. They were a good solid rehab for a rental property. But, when you go to put it on the market, it takes time. You have to methodically, you don't just throw 10 houses on the market and they all get under contract and sold. So, you have to go through all of that, negotiate all of the deals, negotiate the sales deal. Oftentimes the end buyer is going to be a retail customer and they have appraisals and inspections and on and on. So, it takes time. And they were your partner along the way that wasn't holding up their end of the bargain in the day to day. They're not exactly holding up in their end of the bargain in the disillusion either, because there's not a lot in it for them. So, and if you're the money partner, in our case we were, it behooves us to make sure that we do the best to get our money back out of it and get our lenders paid off, because ultimately we're the ones who are going to shoulder the cost of that. So
I think similar to kind of how like any other relationship works, just because a business partnership no longer works or doesn't make sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that like you don't still respect that person as a person, or you don't still, wish the best for them. I think there are relationships where it's like, yeah, that was a waste of everybody's time. But I think there's other ones where it's like, I legitimately, I want nothing but good things for you. This just wasn't a good fit. My first business partner I ever had, I tease new investors who buddy up real quick. That's what I did. Now it worked really well for us for a while. We did a lot of deals. We bought 2 rentals together, and ultimately, Bill mentioned situations change. I moved from St. Louis, where I was working, to Indianapolis, and we kind of had this disconnect of, well, if I do a deal in Indy and do all the work, why am I going to pay you half when you didn't do any of the work and didn't see any of it, and kind of vice versa. So we got to this point where it was like, well, maybe this doesn't make more sense, or this doesn't make sense anymore. I think keeping things professional, trying to be amicable anytime you're ending a business partnership is ideal. I use the grocery store model a lot. Of if I'm at the grocery store and see somebody that I used to work with, I want to be able to walk up to them and ask how the kids were, even if maybe they were a good person, just not a good business person.
Right? Don't go scorched earth unless you really need to.
Oh, absolutely. And I've learned over time to not, unless somebody is really unethical or dishonest, to not burn bridges, because it's surprising how things in life come back around. And things that I thought were dead and buried and gone have come back around to be very profitable situations between myself and other people. So don't burn
Or if
bridges.
you do go scorched earth, be humble enough to pull it back and apologize. Sometimes that helps. Speaking from experience.
So I think in real estate investment, the best partnerships, when you think about the various critical aspects, there's acquisition, there's rehab, there's property management, and then there's financing. Those 4 elements. If a partner can bring a real strong presence in one or more of those elements, then there's somebody to be considered as you in joining together with that person as a real estate investor and as a partnership in real estate investing. Where we kind of went wrong in the Midwest in some of our relationships is, I think I was under the kind of the illusion that if a person could do one of those things really well, of course they could learn the other things. Like we found some people we felt could do acquisition really well. And of course they could do the other aspects that a buy and hold real estate investment company has to do, like property management, like overseeing contractors. And yet I was proven wrong on some of those situations that doesn't necessarily. And so from afar, it's very hard to hold up part of the operation, and we just couldn't build the business for that person. They really needed to learn how to build a business, and some people are really willing to do that, and some people aren't. And
I want to highlight what you just said right there is they were willing to learn part of the business. Because when I started out, I had 2 rentals before you and I met. And they had the same people in them, and I think still do. I mean, they've been there for a long time. And these were like, we joke about $30,000 pigs. These were $22,500 pigs. We paid $50,000 for a package, or $45,000 for a package. And I know early on, I can't count the amount of calls I made to Amanda of like, my tenant ran over the neighbor's bush. What do I do? Like I've not ran into this. So I think it's one thing, if you have a partnership, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be things they have to learn. But I think it comes down to the willingness to learn versus kind of just like not. It's just like choosing to like, well, I'm just not good at that. I think the property management piece, the financial management piece, it really comes down to, I think, running a business, not so much doing real estate. When we started our answering service, I learned really, really quickly, like it's one thing to have one person on payroll. It's something different to have 27 people on payroll. It's one thing when you're pulling in 10,000 a month, when you're pulling in 100,000 a month, there's different challenges. So I think if I had to add like one other characteristic I would add to what I'm looking for in a partner, they've got to be willing to learn, and they've got to be business minded.
An operator. You have to have a business operator. So you have to, back to the Steves for Apple, one's visionary, one's operator. It works. It's a really great, there's many examples of companies that are working well, that it's, if you look at their core characteristics, one's a visionary and one is an operator. I mean, that's really basically breaking it down, because they're more than that, but it helps.
So, Bill, you're in the middle of 14 different business partnerships. Kind of in closing here, why don't you walk us through how you find a good partner? Where have these people kind of come to you from?
Gosh, finding a good partner is like getting out there and networking, and going to your local investment clubs, your RIA groups, talking to people. Looking for people who are like-minded, who have similar long-term goals as yourself. And that's really what you're looking for, is something, of course, and as Andrew mentioned earlier, some partnerships are one and done. Some partnerships are passive and the other person's active. But if you're looking for a partnership where essentially you're both going to spend about the same amount of time, have the same amount of percentage interest as owners, and that, by the way, is something that needs to be negotiated, and sometimes over time that may need to be renegotiated. But you're really out there in the marketplace, just like you're looking for properties. You're looking for really A players. And by the way, one thing we didn't touch on too much is that some of the folks who may start as people working on your property. We have a partner in Dallas, and and I am in partnership with Greg in Dallas, but this person became a third partner with us, and he started as a laborer. And this person, his name is Jay, and he showed himself to be very diligent and, had an ownership mentality from the beginning. These decisions were just as important to him as they were to us. We took note of that, and be on the lookout for A players who you will eventually want to invite into your life as a partner, because A players are going to want a piece of the action. They're going to want to have some kind of ownership interest, and you want them over time to have ownership interest, because then you're all looking out for your own best. You're in a mutually beneficial relationship. So be on the lookout, maybe within your own organization, of raising people to the level of ownership. That's not something to shy away from. It's a good thing. And we've kind of talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there's all that in partnerships. But at the end of the day, you really want to find synergistic relationships, whether they're partners or not partners. They're people in your network. And I guess I would leave you with that. Again, 1 + 1 needs to equal more than 2, needs to equal 3 or more to find the potential of a great partnership. So look us up, thegoodstewards.com. Grab an ebook, put some comments on there for us. We love comments because it helps us get some direction for future episodes and things, issues that we should address. So leave your thoughts with us and tell other people about us.